Hi folks, in this video we talk about Bresson's film Pickpocket and the ultimate meaning of its resolution and its philosophical significance. What I want to ask is whether the film is Dostoevskian or not. That is, are the conditions of success for the characters in the film those of Dostoevsky's view of authentic living or human salvation? So pause your videos now and see if you can make up your minds about this question. What do you think is the most compelling understanding of the movie? Okay, that was your last chance to pause your videos. I'm going to talk about a few of the things that I think are really key for answering this question. One is the relation between individuals and society. It seems like Michel's situation is that of isolation, and he is in need of human connection to Jean, to Jacques, to his mother especially. So his mother asks, for example, why don't you come and see me? What are your inner motivations? Why is he walking away? And he says at one point, I do love my mother more than myself. But I think this is a deeply enigmatic remark, because he certainly isn't acting like the kind of person who loves his mother more than himself. So I think partly he feels this struggle, and this quote, in my opinion, illustrates his struggle more than actually any kind of deep self-knowledge on his part. Another important aspect that we need to think about is the voiceover technique, and how what he's doing is writing a confession. I think this is really essential, because one of Dostoevsky's central themes is a public confession, because what a public confession is an admission of one's sinful nature and a request for forgiveness that is so key for Dostoevsky's vision. And it seems like that is exactly what Michel is going through here. So the voiceover framing technique seems to precisely support a Dostoevskian idea. But let me say, it's not unambiguous, because this is just another technique that the film uses to undermine Michel's ideas. There's many parts of this confession, I think, that are a bit ironic. I mean, one of them is given here. I lost my earnings at cards or wasted them on women. Michel is not some sort of playboy who's like carousing around with women and spending his money left and right. This seems to illustrate the idea that Michel doesn't understand his own motivations, and it's really questionable how we're even supposed to take this line of dialogue, in my opinion. So I think this really does raise good questions about whether or not Michel is saved. There's ways in which the film portrays him as saved at the end, but since the film has been undermining his character throughout, I think we can still reasonably question whether or not that's fully genuine. Even right before this act of being saved, Michel says, "Why even go on living?" He's seemingly contemplating suicide here. This shows he's in the grips of despair until the very last moments of the film. I think that's what it's telling us. So here's some reasons for thinking that film actually is Dostoevskian that I've been talking about. So he does confess ultimately and admit that he needs help. And he admits that he's in the wrong. And in a sense, this is rejecting his Superman theory. His conscience gets the better of us. And that's precisely what we see happens to Ivan in Brothers Karamazov, except Ivan doesn't recant and get saved. So Michel seems like he's in a similar state of despair as Ivan, but he ends up figuring out a way to get saved by finding the right humans. Luckily for him, he's got Jean in his world rather than Katya, and that's how he gets saved. So I think there are a lot of reasons why you might say this is a Dostoevskian style movie. But I think there's plenty of counter evidence too. So let me just reiterate a couple of the points I've been saying that you could use to argue the other side. I mean, for one thing, we don't see a major public confession. We don't ultimately learn who's the audience for this confession that he writes down. He's seemingly sort of talking in his own mind again. It still seems too private. Whereas a true Dostoevskian confession has to be public. This is really essential to Dostoevsky's vision of true human acknowledgement. Another idea is, even though Michel suffers, and we saw that in the previous line of dialogue from Jean, it's not clear that this is the right kind of suffering. For Dostoevsky, not all suffering is redemptive. You can be tortured. You can torture yourself through suffering. That is exactly what happens to Ivan. And we can wonder whether or not Michel actually is, suffering like Dmitri, suffering in the redemptive way. this something else that I've said is, the theme that Michel lacks self-knowledge really might deeply undermine his confession or other aspects of his resolution with that he seemingly gets with Jean in the climactic scene. Another interesting point that you could say, which I haven't mentioned much, is whether or not he truly has a self. So I said that Michel's state of despair is not sort of repressing part of himself, and so he has no reconciliation. He's not aware of his spiritual side enough, and we see that metaphorically in the in his room, in the way in which his empty room full of nothingness, it's destitute. His spiritual self is like shriveled up and died, if the room is a metaphor for that. And in that case, he is like the character of Yvonne. That is his state of despair. It's not that he's lacking a reconciliation like Dmitri and feeling the pull of two sides. Rather, he is in Yvonne's state, or maybe even, you might even go further and say he has no self, like he's like in Smerdykov's state or something. Now, ultimately, I don't think that's exactly right. What I think the film is depicting for us through its subtle means is he has a self. His soul, his spirit is there. It is just depicted in all of the scenes, in all of the filmmaking techniques when it tries to make manifest that which you can't, the immaterial soul or his spirit. And we see this most explicitly in some of the use of the formal features that Bresson makes. So let me talk about those formal features next. So you might think that the film undermines the climactic scene, but what I'm going to try to do is argue for this claim that actually the climactic scene is genuine, and ultimately the film is Dostoevskian. So that's the ultimate thesis I'm going to try to convince you of. But I think the movie is interesting because it's not just it's not so simple, and I think there's really plenty of room for dissent. Ultimately, though, what I'm going to try to convince you is Bresson is just like Dostoevsky. He's got a fundamentally Dostoevskian conception of salvation, and wonderfully, I've got this little bit of evidence I can tell you. Bresson has this quote about himself, "I am a Christian atheist," and I think this is such an amazing line. This is quite a bit of self-awareness on Bresson's part. I think this is exactly what Dostoevsky would say about himself. As you can tell from the way in which I argued for the existentialist reading of so many of Dostoevsky's symbols in other videos. So now I'm going to try to convince you this is Bresson's true view too, and that we see this in the resolution of the film Pickpocket. Let's talk about the formal features, because these are essential for the reading that I'm going to give of it. The film is so unusual in many ways, in its editing, in its photography, in the acting and in the sound. So let me give you illustrations of each of these. I mean, the editing is almost most obvious. The way in which there are so many empty staircases and empty doorways. The film gives us an extra second before Michel comes in and after he leaves the scene. And it's important to realize that this was self-consciously contrary to all filmmaking conventions. The standard rule in filmmaking is you start a scene as late as possible. Filmmaking is all about economy. For one thing, every minute of screen time is costing money. Budgetary constraints are huge in filmmaking. And the other is audiences are so easily bored. And so in films, people try to start the scene as late as possible. You jump in the middle of the action and you let the story unfold. You don't start it pointlessly early. And this film almost starts every scene pointlessly early. It's so fascinating. And what I think Bresson was trying to do is he's trying to show us what is not there. He is trying to slow down the pacing to make it about the interior life of Michel rather than just the exterior action. That Bresson's filmmaking is really part of the point of this movie. I think is really illustrated by some of the sequences that it's most famous for. So there are these montage sequences in which we have cut together a bunch of different scenes of the crime, like where Michel is learning the trade of pickpocketing, or when they're going through the train or the railway stations, the hotel lobbies, and doing these subtle acts of pickpocketing. It's so carefully orchestrated. What Bresson is telling us in these scenes, I mean, for one, it's just beautiful. It's beautiful cinematography. It's beautiful photography. The mise en scène is just incredible in these scenes. But I think what Bresson is showing, in a sense, he's showing off how beautiful he can construct these scenes of thievery. And the craft of pickpocketing, in my view, is here metaphorical for the craft of filmmaking. Bresson is showing us that the filmmaking is essential to understanding what is going on in this movie. And you should pay as much attention to his maneuvers in filmmaking as he is paying attention to the maneuvers and the sleight of hand of these pickpocketers. He, in a sense, he is trying to do sleight of hand with filmmaking in depicting what cannot be shown, what is unshowable. And I think that's really what the ultimate meaning of all of these shots, for example, when Michelle is trying to rob the man at the train station near the end of the movie here. The action, the thing that is not seen is what we're supposed to really be subtly noticing here. And his eyes, which are seemingly dead, are allowing us to pause and see into his soul. That's what is continually being depicted. And it's this partly explains the amazingly bizarre thing that you might have noticed that is almost, it just jumps out at you, which is the acting in this film. Bresson explicitly directed all of the characters to act completely deadpan. And if you might have just started watching the movie without knowing this, and maybe you thought it was just terrible acting or just a terrible movie. What I'm telling you now is this was a self-conscious decision by Bresson. Why would he do such a thing? I think it is to not, because their outward emotion is not the point. The point is their inward emotion. And by hiding it, that it makes us question what is going on in the minds of these characters. And all of this, I think, is building to help us understand what is going on in the final scene. It's the spiritual climax of the character that we're supposed to understand. That is what everything has slowly been building to. The place I think this is most obvious, most explicit, is in the use of the sound in the film. So how do we read the final scene? I think this is a really tough call, but the thing that I think solidifies the Dostoevskian reading of it, that this is actually a triumph. This is spiritual salvation for him. That's what I think, is in the use of the soundtrack. Hopefully you paid attention to the sound in the movie. Oftentimes, the film actually does have a sound, has a score, but you would not know it for most of the movie. Oftentimes the score is literally silent. All we hear is diegetic sound, like the clanking of the cell opening or the people's footsteps in the empty hallways. Every once in a while, the orchestral score actually strikes up. We see it in these moments when he's doing pickpocketing earlier on. This is his sort of salvation. Oh, I'm sorry, my cat just meowed and wants out of this room. So that was not actually the movie. I'm going to play for you 3 minutes of the sound of this movie, and I can let my cat out of the room while I do so. And what I want you to do is listen with no visuals to what's going on in the sound. And this will, I'm going to have to hide this somehow. Okay, I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to hide this. So you can just listen to the sound. Here it goes.
Il y avait autre chose que je ne lui avais pas dit. Pourquoi vivre? Je n'avais rien décidé encore. Jeanne ne revint pas. À la lecture de cette lettre, mon cœur a battu violemment. chose illumina sa figure.
Okay, and that's the final climax of the movie. So this is what I'm hoping you're noticing. The sound in the film. I mean, maybe you thought I stopped it. All I showed you was 3 minutes of the final 3 minutes of the movie with the sound alone. And if you pay attention to what happens next, it cuts to black and they just plays the orchestral score for another 1 or 2 minutes. And I think what Bresson is doing here, it said that Bresson carefully thought about every single sound effect and note in the entire film. What he's doing is he's giving us a completely austere conception of what the interior life of Michel is like through this very unusual use of sound, so that we see the orchestral score as the counterpoint to it. The metaphor of his room being spiritually dead, the soundtrack is conveying, is building that metaphor, and then the score in the end, that is a spiritual awakening. That is this audible, the sound manifestation of his spirit. And when it plays with their resolution, when they have finally found each other at the end of the film, what I think the film is doing is Bresson is displaying this as his spiritual salvation, and this is his spiritual awakening. The only other times we've seen this before is in these pickpocketing moments where, you know, his spirit could go this direction. This is where the only other times he's felt spiritually alive, but that is not where his salvation resided, because that was just the life that brought him more isolation, that brought him against society. But in order to find salvation, what he needs to do is unify with society. And this is deeply represented by the maternal figure of Jean here. So Michel's mother is already dead. He can't make good that relationship. But Jean is, in a sense, the surrogate mother figure for him. This is his chance at a family. And Jacques' child, in a sense, is the ability for Michel to care for and be a nurturing person. So when he finally finds this relationship at the end of the film, that is what I think really makes this ultimately a Dostoevskian movie. Okay, thanks.